the Jewish Museum London, where I have been working for 3 years now, working with our collection and sharing highlights of the collection with members of the public. As you will be able to see from behind me, I'm not at the museum at the moment. We are currently in lockdown here in the UK. So I'm at my home, and instead I'm going to be sharing my screen with you all to share images of the museum, of the galleries, and of the collection. So I'm starting off with this image here. This shows you the outside of our museum building. The very first Jewish Museum, London, was founded back in 1932 by Professor Cecil Roth, Alfred Rubens, and Wilfrid Samuel. That one would have looked very different to the current museum building that you can see on our screen. The very first museum was essentially just a room in Woburn House in Bloomsbury. One of our long-standing volunteers once described it to me as a corridor packed full of objects. And I rather like the sort of visual image that gives us. However, in 1994, we moved to this very elegant Grade 2 listed house in Camden Town, which is where we still are today and where most of our collection is stored. The original collection of the Jewish Museum was focused on Judaica. Now, it would be stepping into our first gallery, so imagining ourselves virtually stepping through the doors of the museum. You would come to this gallery, Judaism, a Living Faith. And this is where you would see much of the collection from the very first Jewish museum. The gallery is laid out so that the floor plan is of a Star of David, which you can sort of get a sense from this image. It's also trying to recreate the feeling that you would have if you were to enter a synagogue. So there is the Torah scroll on the stand in front of us, and then behind that, a very large object that is 3 meters tall and 2 meters wide, and definitely dominates this particular gallery. Does anyone like to guess for me what this object might be? And do feel free to unmute yourself to ask or answer any questions, or use the chat function if you prefer. Does anyone want to guess what this object is?
Wait, please. Is that the where they house the Torah?
Absolutely, yes. It is the synagogue ark, which is where the Torah scrolls of a community would be stored. We can see an image here of this particular ark open and the Torah scrolls inside.
But what is it made of? Is it wood, carved wood, or?
It's wood. It's made of Italian walnut, but the pillars are designed to look like marble.
Oh, beautiful.
It is.
A lot of work.
And the reason why I started off by asking you what you thought this was is because the owner of this object, before it came into our museum's collection, didn't know that this was a synagogue ark. He didn't actually know that it was a Jewish object at all. And that was George Bennett, the 7th Earl of Tankerville, who had it in his home in Chillingham Castle in Northumberland. So my next question, if you'd like to have a guess, is if you didn't know this was a synagogue ark, you didn't know this was a Jewish object, what might you
Do you need anything?
think it is?
The gloves.
What could you use?
Cupboard?
A cupboard. Absolutely. It was used as a wardrobe. And it wasn't just any wardrobe, it was used as a servant's wardrobe, which does make me wonder what wardrobe would have been like if this very grand synagogue ark was a servant's wardrobe in Chillingham Castle. But anyway, when he died in 1931, many of his belongings were auctioned off, and a London bookseller recognised that this was an ark, purchased it and donated it to the museum. But What we don't know is what its story is before it came into the possession of the 7th Earl of Tankerville, because this actually dates to the 17th century and northern Italy. So you've got a bit of a blank between 17th century northern Italy and 20th century Northumberland. So we will like to speculate on what its story is, how it might actually have got there. Yes, and as Renee has said, there is Hebrew on the top of it, so you'd think they would recognize that this is a Jewish object. It says, "Know before whom thou standest," which is quite typical to see on an ark. There are other clues as well that show us that this is a Jewish object. On the doors that are facing us, on the left-hand door, there is a menorah, which is possibly one of the most instantly recognizable Jewish symbols. And then here we have the key or the cup for ritual hand washing. So again, Jewish symbols on here that you'd think might make somebody recognize what this actually is. The elaborate decoration really shows how precious and important an object this is as well. Each object in our collection has a number. Today, we have got around 40,000 objects in our collection. This one is number 14. So as well as being one of the largest and the oldest objects in this gallery, it is also one of the very first ones to come into our collection. Did anyone have any questions about this synagogue ark? You're welcome to use the chat function or unmute yourself and ask me. Okay. I will move on to the next object. If any questions occur to you as we go through, do feel free to type them in the chat. I will also make sure there is time for questions at the end. But let's explore the Judaism gallery a little bit more. So, yeah, had a look at the image of the ark open. I'm now going to move on to what I think is one of the most important objects in our Judaism gallery. But unlike the ark, which is by far the most enormous object in the gallery and really does dominate the space, this is an object that I would like to guess that most people who visit our museum might not even spot it, because it is currently on display with many much larger and much grander hanukkah lamps. But I think this one is actually the most important of all of them, because this hanukkah lamp is the oldest hanukkah lamp that is known to be made in this country, known to be made in England. It's a pretty good claim to fame. It was made all the way back in 1709 and was made as a wedding present for Elias Lindo on the marriage to his wife, Rachel. He was just 19 years old when they were married. On the front, there is a figure of a man. He is raising his right hand up. This is a figure of the prophet Elijah. He is reaching to, what we have here are two ravens. If your eyesight is much better than mine, you might be able to make out that they've got food in their mouths that they are bringing to him. This is depicting a scene from the Tanakh when God sends food and drink to Elijah by ravens, both day and night. Elijah being the Hebrew name of Elias, which is why this story was chosen for the Hanukkah lamp that was made in his honor. Elias's father, Isaac Lindo, had fled the Inquisition in the Canary Islands and settled in London in 1670. This was just 15 years after Jewish people were allowed to return to Britain. And I'll talk a bit more about the readmission of the Jews later on. His son Elias was born 20 years later in 1690. And Elias worked at the London Stock Exchange, and he named his first son Isaac after his father. Now, not currently on display, but in our stores, and that is the benefit of these virtual tours, is that I can show you images of objects that don't get seen as much. we have this miniature. It's in a framed locket, and it depicts a member of the Lindo family, although we're not entirely sure if this is showing us Elias or Isaac. So we've sort of got to hope there's a bit of a family resemblance and we can get a sense of what both of them would have looked like. The Lindos were really prominent members of the early Sephardi community in London. They were founders of the Bevis Marks Synagogue. This is the oldest synagogue to continue to hold religious services in this country. It's been having services there for over 300 years. The Lindos were also known for being patrons of the art, their contributions to science and literature, and their many charitable donations.
How do you spell the name?
Lindo.
Yes.
Lindo. I can
Lindo?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I can
Thank you.
type it in the chat function if you would like it.
I don't have access to anything.
Okay, that's fine. So sadly, Elias passed away when he was just 37 years old. But this lamp has really kept his memory alive. It was passed down through the Lindo family for many, many years until in 1932, when our museum opened, it came into our collection and it was later purchased by the museum. And the lamp has been on display ever since. I mentioned that each object in our collection has a number. This didn't come into our collection quite as early as the Torah Ark that we looked at earlier, the synagogue Ark, sorry. But this one is number 230. And I think 230 out of 40,000 is still pretty good going and gives us an idea of just how early it came into our collection.
Excuse me, what is it made of? Is it brass or?
Silver.
Silver. Oh, pure silver?
Yes. Yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful hanukkah lamp. The detail on it is so intricate. It was made by a man called John Ruslin, who is a very senior silversmith in London. I can see we've had some questions come in to the chat function. Let me just have a look. Interesting question about how we use the Torah scrolls at the museum, whether we use them to sort of say liturgical prayers or something like that. We currently don't at the museum. In many instances, not all, but in many instances, we get donated a Torah when it is no longer kosher, when it is no longer fit for use. So it still holds a really important sort of historical value, and it tells the story of an individual community that we want to keep on telling, but they wouldn't necessarily be, wouldn't always be kosher to be able to use in that way.
Right.
I've also got a question about whether the Lindo family were those who donated to the Lindo wing at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. I'm not actually sure. I haven't come across that wing before. You've got better knowledge than me about St Mary's Hospital, but it definitely wouldn't surprise me because there are quite a few things that are named after that family because they were so known for their charitable donations. Oh, and many members of the royal family were born there. Thank you for sharing. Okay, does anyone have any more questions? Okay, let's move on to explore more about our museum. So our collection is no longer focused solely on Judaica. On the second floor of our museum, we have our gallery, History, a British Story. And this tells the story of Jewish people in Britain over many, many years. This is because of another London museum who we've merged with. This was the London Museum of Jewish Life. It was founded in 1983 as the Museum of the Jewish East End, and it had the aim of rescuing and preserving the disappearing heritage of London's East End, which is very much the heartland of Jewish settlement in Britain. They changed their name because whilst the East End remained an important focus, the museum wanted to expand and look at more areas of Jewish history in Britain. So it went right back to the Middle Ages and right up to the end of the 20th century. In 1995, this museum merged with the Jewish Museum, and they were sort of operating on two different sites until in 2010, the museum was able to reopen on our current site in Camden, having bought what was formerly a piano factory, which backed onto the museum. And so now our museum is much longer inside than you would imagine. It's much bigger than it looks from the outside. And we've just celebrated our 10th anniversary of this newer, bigger building. What we are looking at now is a photograph of what the history gallery looks like. And I would like to share with you some objects that tell the story of Jewish people in England and Jewish people in Britain, right from the Middle Ages. So now we are looking at one of the oldest objects in this gallery. Our gallery starts in 1066 when William I, or William the Conqueror, moved a community of Jewish people from Rouen in France over to London to improve trade links. This was the very first Jewish community in London. And on entering our history gallery, you would see some of the very, very few objects that survive that we know belonged to members of this community. What we are looking at is the smallest of these objects. If, like me, you are looking at it on a laptop or a computer screen, you are probably seeing it much larger than it is in real life. It is just 2 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters, and it is a medieval brass signet ring. And on the right-hand side is a modern piece of wax. So we can see what the print of the signet ring would be. The design is of a snake, and underneath the snake, a ram. There is also Hebrew writing on it, which you can see over on the right-hand side. This lets us know the name of the person who owned it, which was Aaron. Although sadly, we do not know who this particular Aaron was. It is displayed next to pottery fragments belonging to the wealthy Londoner Aaron, son of Vives. So I always like to imagine it's his ring, but that's probably highly unlikely. We'll have to leave the mystery of who this Aaron was. This ring dates to the 13th century. And at this time, both Aarons, the ring's owner and Aaron's son of Vives, would have been experiencing increasing acts of anti-Semitism and acts of discrimination. There were successive laws passed throughout the 13th century, placing increasing limitations on the lives of Jewish people in England. There are far too many different acts to be able to list in this talk. We would be here all night. Instead, I will just share with you some of the key ones. So by the end of the 13th century, Jewish people were no longer allowed to purchase any land, although they could keep the land they already had. They couldn't leave any money to their children. Instead, at their death, all their money went to the king, and they couldn't join any guilds. This effectively barred them from many trades, limiting their opportunities to earn an income. Their communities as a whole were hindered from growing as they were no longer allowed to build any new synagogues. In 1275, all Jewish people over the age of 7, by law, had to wear a yellow badge, which was called a tabula, on their outer clothing, which would make them easily identifiable as Jewish. This made them vulnerable to acts of anti-Semitism in the streets of London. Since 1222, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, had forbidden Jewish people from mixing with Christian people, which seems to have increased the anti-Semitism. It created this idea of Jewish people as separate, as different as the other. and there were acts of anti-Semitism that broke out. Again, too many to name. Perhaps the most significant of these was in 1264. This was when a mob broke out in London and 500 Jewish people were murdered in one night. That was about a sixth of the Jewish population of the country as a whole. Things reached a climax in 1290 when the Act of Expulsion was passed. Under this, all remaining Jewish people were brought to London in carts and sent out through the port of London. From 1290 to 1656, it was illegal to be Jewish in this country. The expulsion means that there are very few items in existence that we can date with any certainty to this first Jewish community in Britain. So that gives us the question of how we actually came across this ring, how it came into our collection. Well, it's got quite an interesting story because it's quite a sort of happy accident that we had it at all, because it was discovered in a field in Kent in 1929. And it's one of the only items we can say with any certainty belonged to a member of the first Jewish community. And even rarer, we have a name of the owner, Aaron, giving us this sort of direct link to a member of that first Jewish community in London. Are there any questions about this ring or that first community?
Did you say that was a ring?
Yes, we're looking at the top of the ring here.
Interesting.
I've had a question of where this first community went to after they were expelled. Many would have gone to Brittany in France, partly because it was nearer, it was easy to get to, but also because whilst France had had an expulsion already, that had been overturned. So at this point, Jewish people were allowed to go to France, although they had a later expulsion and the community would have been forced to leave. Sadly,
what is the ring made of?
It's a brass ring.
Brass?
Mm.
Oh, looks like stone.
Yes, I could see that. I think it's had a little bit of wear on it. It's not as smooth as we picture brass.
Mm-hmm. Brass.
Okay, let's move forward in time and through the gallery. Looking at another object. So our history gallery continues with the readmittance of Jewish people to Britain. In 1656, Oliver Cromwell readmitted Jewish people here, and his reasons for doing this are rather heavily debated. Some people see it as this great act of tolerance and acceptance, which is not something we often associate with him. Others argue that it was economically advantageous to have a Jewish community in London, when a key trading partner was the Jewish community of Amsterdam. Whatever his motivation was, for the first time in 366 years, Jewish people could openly declare their religion in Britain. However, they were faced with the prevailing stereotype that had grown in this period that Jewish people were weak and defenseless. A really important figure to be able to combat this at the time was Daniel Mendoza, who is shown on this jug. He is the boxer shown on the left-hand side of the jug. At 20 centimeters tall, it is far from the largest object in the history gallery, but I can say it's definitely one of the most popular with visitors. Born on the 5th of July, 1764, Mendoza was an English prize fighter and boxing champion. He was a bare-knuckle boxer, which meant that the match ended when an opponent was knocked out or unable to continue. Being Jewish and a successful boxer, you might think he was quite a strong case against the established idea of Jewish people as weak. However, his fighting technique was used against him. Mendoza had actually revolutionized the world of boxing. At the time, most people would go into boxing matches with the idea of just trying to hit the other person as hard as you could. Mendoza came up with the clever and really revolutionary idea of instead trying to avoid being hit. I find it absolutely bizarre that this wasn't already a thing. If you ever put me in a boxing ring, I'm sure it'd be my natural instinct to try to duck or avoid being hit. But it was brand new at the time and led to him being extremely successful. However, his critics argued that instead it proved that Jewish people were cowardly because they were always trying to dodge the punches. And it led to his sort of technique being known as the Jewish school of boxing. Despite this, though, he did have many, many successes and really raised the profile of Jewish people in Britain. He was the first Jewish person to be introduced to the king. He had ballads sung about him. His name appeared in the script of many famous shows of the day. He was even so famous that one of his matches knocked the storming of the Bastille off the front pages of the newspaper. Which is why I feel I'm being a little bit mean by showing you this jug, because this jug actually shows his great defeat rather than his victory. He is shown here in a boxing match against Richard Humphreys. This was his sort of most famous opponent. They met 3 times, and this shows their second match, which is the only one that Mendoza lost. It was on Wednesday, the 9th of January, 1788. And his supporters, mostly Jewish people from the East End, lost around £50,000 in bets on this match. That's about £7.1 million in today's money. So we can imagine there was quite a lot of outrage about it. However, he did win the third and final match between the two of them. There he is on the left-hand side. Another thing, another legacy he's given to boxing is the idea of wearing your hair short. He was once in a boxing match with Gentleman John Jackson, which was his name, Gentleman John, and Jackson won by pulling Mendoza's long hair, as we saw in the image before, and holding him in a headlock with it. And so he cut his hair short and had much more success in boxing. And to this day, boxers tend to wear their hair short, and it's something that was started by Mendoza. Now, sadly, Mendoza had to continue fighting even when he was past his prime, and his success rate sort of went down and down and down. And when he passed away, when aged 70, he actually died penniless, leaving his wife in poverty. And since then, I think it's fair to say his name has been a bit forgotten, which is why I like to talk about him on these tours. However, if any of you have ever watched the original Pink Panther films starring Peter Sellers, you will have seen images of Mendoza, because Peter Sellers is the great-great-grandson of Daniel Mendoza. And to sort of raise the profile of his ancestor, he put images of Daniel Mendoza in the background on the walls of Inspector Clouseau's flat. So if you watch it again, you will spot Daniel Mendoza.
Okay.
Any questions about Daniel Mendoza? I will move on now. So I mentioned the Jewish East End at the beginning. The largest section of our history gallery is dedicated to telling the story of the Jewish East End. In this virtual tour, I would like to share with you items relating to my favourite topic in the East End section of the museum. And they link to this mystery object. I want to ask, does anyone want to guess what this object is? Feel free to use the chat function or share with me. What could it be?
Looks like a wig.
Oh, you are so close with wig, but not quite.
Oh no. It's not a human head, is it?
No, it's not. That would be quite creepy, I think.
Yes. Oh, what's that? It's an eyeball. What's that object in the center?
It's the stand that it's on. This is here. So it's just this sort of false hairpiece.
It's a hairpiece.
Wow, I'm being very, very mean. I picked one of the hardest objects to guess. I've been sharing this object for about 3 years, and I think I've only ever had one person work out what it is. It's not a very common object, but what we're looking at now is a false beard.
A what?
A false beard,
What's that?
a fake beard, a sort
Oh,
of
a
costume
beard.
beard.
A beard?
Yeah.
Made of human hair?
No, it's a costume piece.
Uh-huh.
It was worn as part of a costume in Yiddish theatre. In every
Oh.
country Jewish people migrated to as part of the Great Migration, they followed a really rich Yiddish cultural life. By the 1890s, the East End had free Yiddish daily newspapers. However, it was Yiddish theatre where Yiddish really blossomed, and it became the primary form of entertainment for the immigrant working class. Modern Yiddish theatre rose in the late 1800s and was created almost single-handedly in London by a man called Abraham Goldfaden. Now, he had been studying to be a rabbi, but he actually gave this up to go into the theatre business. Such was his passion for the theatre. This was on Prince's Street, just off Brick Lane, where he built the very first purpose-built Yiddish theatre in 1886. And very quickly, it became the leading venue for Yiddish theatre in Europe. It was also the start of professional acting, being the first time that actors were paid regular wages, which was £3 10 a week. During the war years, London was the only city in Europe to continually hold Yiddish theatre performances, with actors performing in air raid shelters and undergrounds during the Blitz. I'd like to share this poster with you, which is from February 1944. This poster was used to advertise the Yiddish play, The King of Lampedusa, which was staged, as we can see from the top right-hand corner of this, at the Grand Palais Theatre in 1943. This play was written in that same year by S.J. Harrendorf, and it was based on a true story, the story of RAF Flight Sergeant Sidney Cohen. Cohen was a tailor from Clapton in the East End who was serving in the RAF during the war. Now, whilst on active service, he had to make a forced landing on the island of Lampedusa. This forced landing caused the entire Italian garrison to surrender to him because they thought they were being invaded. And so this earned him the nickname, the King of Lampedusa. I think it is a brilliant story. I've loved it since I first discovered it, and I can see why this was such a successful play. It ran for 6 months, which was the longest run of any Yiddish play in London. The Grand Palais became the permanent home of Yiddish theatre after the war. However, the Jewish population of the East End of London started to move away. The population there declined, and they tended to move further north. Today, the areas with the largest Jewish communities in London tend to be the areas around Mill Hill, Hendon, Golders Green, less so the East End. Yiddish as a language was also dying out. It had been the first language of many first-generation migrants to London. However, for their children, it didn't tend to be the first language. And so the audiences for Yiddish theatre gradually declined. And the Grand Palais had to open during the day for bingo to subsidise the declining interest. However, due to lack of funds, it was forced to close in 1970. And there's been no permanent home for Yiddish theatre in the UK since. though I hear Yiddish is on the rise here, so you never know what the future holds. Are there any questions about Yiddish theatre? I understand there is still permanent Yiddish theatres in America. I think it's in New York and also Tel Aviv as well. So there are some in some places. Right. As we move on, I'm just going to touch briefly on this here because our history gallery does lead on to our Holocaust gallery. I'm just going to say from the start, I'm not going to be showing any upsetting images. Or going into great detail on this topic. So at the Jewish Museum, we do have a Holocaust gallery, and this tells the story of the Holocaust through the experiences of one man, Leon Greenman, who is the only British-born survivor of Auschwitz. You can see our gallery here. I'm going to focus on this particular image, which shows Leon Greenman in June 1942 with his wife Elsa and his son Barney, both of whom were murdered during the Holocaust. Leon and Elsie had met at an organised event where Leon was singing. He had a very good singing voice. We've got recordings of his singing. And when Elsa first heard him sing, she instantly fell in love with Leon. And she actually said to her friend that that was the man who was going to be her husband. And she was absolutely correct. Elsa was Dutch by birth, but grew up in England. And when she married Leon, she became a British citizen. They decided to settle in Rotterdam to be near Elsa's grandmother, who she was very close to. Leon travelled back and forth to England as he changed career and was now working with his father-in-law as a bookseller. Their son Barney was born on the 17th of March 1940. And when he was born, Leon registered him at the British consulate, so he too had British citizenship. However, less than 2 months later, the Netherlands, which had been neutral, was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany. And under Nazi occupation, Dutch people were subject to the same anti-Semitic laws as the German Jewish community. So whilst this photo gives us quite a happy family scene and shows the affection between Elsa and Leon, and you can really sense sort of the love that they have for their young son, they're actually living through a very difficult situation. By this time, anti-Semitism would have been very high, and they would already have seen some of their Jewish friends disappearing without a trace. They decided to give many of their possessions to their non-Jewish friends, the Van Nauters, for safekeeping. This included English money, rare books, and most importantly, their passports. Their friends burnt their English passports, which meant the family couldn't prove their British identity, which was really pivotal in their story. The family were taken to Auschwitz. Leon was the only survivor. And after liberation, he was one of the first survivors to talk about what he had experienced, although his interview for the BBC just a few weeks after liberation was never aired, as the contents was seen as too horrific. Leon was really committed to telling his story, as well as being an activist challenging racism and hate crime in the many forms it has appeared since the Holocaust. He was really, really committed to our museum. He was always in the museum on a Sunday to speak to visitors, as well as coming in to speak to school groups. The Holocaust Gallery has his involvement in it all the way through, in the wording, in the objects, in the images. And the objects displayed are items that he has donated to our museum. He's donated many more objects than there are room to display, but which are many of which available in our online collections and also shared with school groups and researchers. Leon never saw his gallery in its new location in our current home, but he knew it was going to happen, and he was really pleased with the fact that his voice continued to be heard. And when he passed away, much of his personal collection was left to our museum, and we work hard to continue his legacy. Are there any questions? So I would like to finish off with one more object to share with you, because our story of our museum continues when in 2015 we merged with the Jewish Military Museum. And so we have taken on about 5,000 objects in our collection that tell the story of the military service of Jewish men and women. These objects have been included in our displays in the History Gallery. I'd like to talk about this particular object though. This is right at the top of the main staircase, so it would be the last object that you would see as you leave our museum. This is a nurse's cape that belonged to Doris Benjamin. She supported the war effort by volunteering as a nurse with the Voluntary Aid Detachment during the Second World War. What we are looking at is actually the inside of the cape. It's displayed inside out. The outside would have been a sort of blue-grey colour. Inside, the lining is red, and there are regimental badges sewn on the inside. Soldiers would give their badges to the nurses who looked after them. There are 177 regimental badges on this cape, showing you just how many people Doris Benjamin cared for. We can have a closer look at some of the different badges on this cape. So over on the right-hand side, which is enlarged to the left, we have a badge with a cat on it. This is the badge for the 56th London Infantry Division. This division was first raised in 1908, and they took part in the Allied offensive, which ended the war in Italy. The cat is meant to be Dick Whittington's cat and was chosen as a symbol of London. Then moving along the cape, we have this regimental badge of the 25th Indian Division with a black spade on it. This was a division that was formed in southern India in 1942 and fought in the Burma campaign. The insignia prompted the nickname the Ace of Spades Division, and they chose this sign because of its simplicity, but also to represent the fact that they were the top of the pack. And then over here we have an eagle. You may recognize this, of course, because it is actually an American military badge. It belonged to the 101st Airborne Division, who were nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, which is why they have the eagle on their bag. It was a specialized light infantry division trained for air assault operations, and it's still part of the US Army today. And then showing you an image that shows the reverse of the cape as it is displayed in our museum. We have this badge here, which is of the Eastern Command, or the UK Home Command. This covered East Anglia and Central Midlands, and they chose the British Bulldog because it was a symbol of determination and also always being on guard, the Home Command. These badges show how the Allies were working together during the Second World War. Doris didn't only care for British soldiers, but also for American, Indian, French, and other wounded soldiers. The cape shows the incredible work that Doris did during the Second World War, caring for so many soldiers, and is an example of the wider contribution that was made by women to the war effort. The cape also demonstrates the gratitude of the soldiers to Doris for gifting their badges, and Doris's modesty in sewing these badges on the inside of the cape. So when she wore them, people wouldn't see them. They wouldn't know how many people she had cared for. It was Doris herself who donated the cape to the Jewish Military Museum, and we're really proud to have it on display inside out, and for it to be the last object that visitors see when they leave our galleries. So thank you so much for inviting me to join you today to share objects from our collection with you. It's really lovely to be able to continue to tell the story of our museum, even while our physical doors might have to be closed. And it's really wonderful to be able to share our collection with a group of people so far away who before lockdown, I wouldn't have considered being able to do this on Zoom. So in a way, I feel like it's brought different groups of people closer together and allowed us to share our collection more widely. I can see a couple of questions coming into the chat function. I've got a question asking, what's his name, please? And I'm afraid I've lost, I can't see who it was you were asking about. Was it Leon Greenman? Is that who you were asking about in the Holocaust gallery? It was Leon Greenman who was the survivor.
Yes, that's who I was referring to. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yes, an incredible man. Were there any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is the museum open all the time, and do they give tours for, what are we, when you go there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So at the moment, because of the lockdown that we've got in Britain, our museum is closed. Whenever it may be, when we get back to being able to reopen, then yes, we do run tours and events at the museum.
That's nice, interesting.
Thank you.
My brother-in-law, should rest in peace, was in the army there. He was in
really?
yes, he's from Manchester. His family's from Manchester.
There is a Jewish museum in Manchester.
That you